Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Welcome, everyone. It gives me tremendous pleasure to welcome Barbara Arrowsmith-Young to Microsoft. It's really a real great pleasure for me personally to have you come and speak to a Microsoft audience. This is something that I know that I've been thinking about for a long time, and thanks to other folks who are very familiar with your work, that we were able to make this happen. So we're really looking forward to it. I just wanted to say very few words and then leave most of the time for Barbara to have a chance to speak, and then also I think we'll have ample time for Q&A. I think it was in 2008 that I read the Norman Doidge's book, The Brain That Changes Itself, and I came across Barbara's work. This was in the summer of 2008, and in the fall of 2008, we were enrolled with our youngest daughter in Vancouver in the Eton Arrowsmith program. And ever since then, both Barbara's life story as well as her life's work have been a real inspiration for us as a family. I think that, as you will hear in the talk today and as you will read in her book, what she's been able to do is actually, and it's tremendous in the sense of being able to take adversity and turn it into a program that now can take and have such broad impact with anybody with learning disabilities. I think is just an amazing feat, and it's a thing that I think inspires me beyond the field of LD. When I think about Microsoft, I would say the one thing that I know there are a lot of parents here, and for anyone who has learning disabilities or anyone who's a parent, obviously this work that Barbara has done, her vision of how to make that much more ubiquitous is of personal relevance, and that I think is amazing. The other thing that I would also say is, from a Microsoft perspective for us to reflect on, if you look at the genesis of this company, it has all been about democratizing technology and improving and empowering lives. The idea of being able to take the technology that we have and then marry it with the neuroscience and education has, I think, tremendous implications in terms of how you can have societal impact. The other side of it is, if you look at, in fact, Microsoft Research is perhaps doing some of the leading work around AI and the frontiers of AI. And you look at the new theories of even AI, because AI started out thinking that let's ignore the brain. And now I think we're coming a full circle to say let's in fact think about the anatomy of the brain and the neocortex, perhaps even as an inspiration or a constraint of how you build intelligent systems. And I think Jeff Hawkins and his work there has perhaps been the most inspiring work in that field, and I think it has implications on how we even think about building intelligent systems. And then you marry it with this concept of racing with the machine, because when we think about building software, and you really want to build it in such a way that it really gets augmented by the machine, then I would say that Barbara's work has perhaps implications far beyond the specific place where it's being deployed today. And I think that's one of the other things that I would sort of encourage those of you who have come in here and think about this more from a computer science or a neuroscience and data. One of the things that Barbara will allude to is that this is not just one curriculum, but it's a curriculum that's learning. And I think there's a lot that many, both on the research side and on the product side at Microsoft, that we can both learn and then perhaps contribute back, because Barbara's vision is not just about having a program in a few schools, but it's about being able to make it accessible to every student and every teacher and change the face of education as it really meets the frontiers of neuroscience and perhaps computer science. So with that, let me turn it over to Barbara. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Satya. Thank you. The mic's on? Okay. So I want to thank you, Satya, for that lovely introduction, and Eric for making this possible, and Amy also for making this possible and allowing me to come and speak about what I'm passionate about. And I try to, compress my talk, but it's probably somewhere in the order of about an hour, and then I'm open for questions and answers, and I hope you enjoy the journey as I kind of take you into the territory of the brain. And my story is a journey into the territory of the brain, and really what happens when there are cognitive glitches or things that aren't working properly. And if we think about this incredibly complex organ that we really can't escape, and we carry it with us everywhere we go, it has something on the order of 86 billion neurons. And if we think about the world's population at about 7 to 8 billion, it kind of puts it into perspective in terms of the complexity. And also, we have hundreds of trillions of connections in our brain. And again, if we think about all the stars in the Milky Way galaxy, we actually have more connections in our brain than all of the stars in the Milky Way galaxy combined. And to me, what's really fascinating is no two brains are exactly alike. I mean, if you think about the person sitting next to you, or think about a loved one or a family member, and you think about the physical differences between you, like you have different eye color, different shape of your ears, different fingerprints, there's actually more differences between your two brains than all those physical differences combined. So neuroscience has taught us that our brain does shape us. It makes us uniquely who we are. It filters our perceptions and understanding of ourselves, of other people, of our world, and our relationship to that world. And to me, what's most promising is this whole concept of neuroplasticity. We now know that the brain is capable of change, and that it's capable of change across our lifespan. I've worked with students as young as 6 and as old as 81, and I've seen neuroplasticity. And as I'm getting a little older, I'm really actually quite encouraged that there is neuroplasticity as we age. And what that means is, the brain changes at a physiological level, more dendrites, increased neurotransmitters, and that change leads to more efficient and more effective learning. And my story begins with my brain. And it's a personal story, and it's a universal story. The personal was my journey for a hunt for a solution to very, very severe and crippling learning disabilities. And the universal is that we all have a brain, and if we can understand how it functions, I think we can have more compassionate understanding of ourselves and also of others. So for me, growing up, I lived in a world that was really pretty incomprehensible. There was part of my brain I was later to learn that wasn't working properly, and it was the part of the brain that attaches meaning to things, which allows you to comprehend or understand. And for me, it was almost like if I listened to language, it was about as intelligible as Lewis Carroll's The Jabberwocky. I could hear the words, but my brain struggled to attach meaning to those words. If something was really concrete, somebody said it was raining outside, which I understand it does quite often in Seattle, I could conjure up an image because that was concrete. I could paint a picture in my head so I could understand that. But as soon as it got into a relationship, I struggled with that. So if we think about numbers, I could understand what 1 is because I could see 1 object. I could understand what 4 is because I could line up 4 objects. You put that 1 over top of the 4 and it meant nothing to me because that's a relationship, and I could not understand relationships. I couldn't understand how part was related to a whole. Things as simple as my aunt, I really couldn't understand. How could she be my aunt and be my mother's sister? I mean, how could somebody have 2 relationships? It really made no sense to me. And my notebooks growing up were filled with drawings, were filled with diagrams, because I was trying to use my right hemisphere to draw pictures to understand what I couldn't understand in language. And something as simple as telling time, I couldn't read a clock, because to interpret time, you have to understand the relationship between the hour hand and the minute hand to know what that time was. So up until age 25, age 26, I could not read a clock. Things as simple as jokes. I didn't understand jokes, because how do you understand a joke? You hear the irony, kind of the juxtaposition of the language, the things that make it humorous. So like individuals with learning problems, I learned compensations. So what I would do is I would match my laughter to the laughter of the other children, because that would tell me how funny the joke would be, but I had no idea why it was funny. things like con artists. I was incredibly vulnerable to con artists because how do you tell if you're being conned? You hear the logical inconsistencies in what somebody's saying. Well, for me, there was no logic in my world, so obviously there were no logical inconsistencies. So it meant that, that I had a lot of trouble understanding if somebody was being genuine and authentic or whether they were telling me a story. And making decisions was really hard for me. It was paralyzing, because how do you make a decision? You compare and contrast, you weigh alternatives. I couldn't do that, because weighing alternatives, you're comparing one thing to the next. You're seeing a relationship or a connection. In my world, there were no relationships, there were no connections. I got labeled as being rigid, as being stubborn. And I was rigid, and I was stubborn. And change was really hard for me, but it wasn't coming from an emotional place. It was coming from a cognitive difficulty, because I couldn't hold those pieces of information to understand. So if I finally did figure out something, I wanted to hold on to that for dear life, because it always felt that if somebody else said, well, look at it over this way, I had to let go of what I'd come to figure out over here, which was hard won, to allow this to integrate. And it just felt too hard for me. And what happened over time was that really fragmented view of my world led to a very fragmented psyche, a very fragmented personality, where my self-esteem, my self-concept was really, really impacted. And if that wasn't enough, that was one area, I had another area of my brain that wasn't working properly. I was a klutz. I was incredibly uncoordinated. The whole left side of my body was like an alien being. I could put my left hand on a hot burner and I felt pain, but the part of my brain that registered where that sensation was coming from didn't work. So somebody that didn't have that problem would feel the pain, register it in their hand, pull their hand away. I didn't. I would leave my hand on the hot burner. And unless I looked, I didn't know where the pain was coming from and what I needed to do. My mother was convinced I would be dead by the age of 5 because I was so accident prone. I had bruises and cuts and dints on that left side of my body, and I had no idea where they came from. And I kept my fingernails really short, because if I put my hair behind my eye with my left hand, I might scratch my eye out. So I truly was a danger to myself with that difficulty. And if that wasn't enough, there was another problem, another part of my brain that wasn't working. I didn't understand three-dimensional space. So I couldn't construct maps in my head. And as a child, I would get lost in my friend's house because I couldn't construct a map of how those rooms related. So I didn't know how to get from one room to the next, and I would get paralyzed and be lost. Things like geometry and geography were really hard for me because you have to construct spatial relations. And something as simple as crossing a street that we all take for granted, that was terrifying to me, because when you're crossing a street, you have to create a mental map of where you are relative to that car that's coming at you. Well, I couldn't create that map. So again, like children with learning problems did, or do, I created a compensation, and that would be walk blocks out of my way to find a stop sign or a stoplight where I knew the cars had to stop so it would be safe to cross. Or the other strategy was I would wait at the side of the road for however long it took until somebody else came along to cross, and I would follow them across the street, and I would hope that they knew what they were doing a lot better than I did. And my joke was that I would be successful crossing the street with my eyes open as with my eyes closed, and there was truth to that. And if you can kind of think about what my world was like, I wasn't good academically because I didn't understand concepts. I struggled in relationships with people because I didn't understand what they were saying, and I certainly was not an asset to any sports team. I mean, I was the last child ever chosen for any athletic activity, and rightfully so, because my reaction if a ball was coming at me would be to run as quickly as I could in the opposite direction, because more than likely I would end up connecting somehow with that ball in a very painful way. So there was really, for me in school, no area, no arena where I was successful. And when I began school, it was a long time ago in the 1950s, this was the time of what I call the pre-neuroplastic paradigm. When I started grade 1, the belief was your brain is fixed. Basically, the brain you're born with is the brain you're going to die with. And there's nothing you can do about it if you have a problem. You just need to learn to accept or live with it. And in grade 1, I overheard my teacher tell my mother that I had a mental block, because at that time there wasn't even the term learning disability. It didn't exist. So I had a mental block. I was told that I would never learn like other children, that I was slow, and that I had to accept that limitation. And that was my message. The message was really clear. In grade 1, I was sentenced to a lifetime of struggle and pain. And there were a lot of dark moments. I mean, this is me in grade 8. It was right around the time that I attempted suicide, because I couldn't imagine, how could I go to high school? Elementary school was such a struggle, and I just felt like I could not handle it. The mixed blessing was, because my learning disability meant I didn't understand things, I got the instructions wrong, so I wasn't successful in the attempt, which allowed me then to create this work. So, you know, there's kind of a mixed blessing to things. And I think partly I was very blessed. This is my father. He was an inventor and had patents. And I grew up in a family where the belief was, if there's a problem and there's no solution, don't be limited by the conventional wisdom that there's no solution for this problem. He instilled in me, you go out and create your solution. It's kind of the moral imperative that you need to go out and hunt for solutions. So that set me on my life's path to really try to find a solution to the difficulties that I had. And that solution came in the work of a brilliant Russian neuropsychologist, the fellow with the glasses in this picture, Alexander Luria. And he was doing a lot of work after World War II in Russia with Russian soldiers who had very localized head wounds as a result of trauma in the war. And the other gentleman in this picture is Leo Vysotsky. And in the Battle of Smolensk in 1943, Vysotsky suffered a bullet wound to a part of his left hemisphere. And Vysotsky started to keep a journal describing his difficulties. And Luria took this journal and wrote a book called The Man with the Shattered World. And in August of 1977, I remember the day really well, someone gave me a copy of this book, which changed my life. And in this book, in Vysotsky's journal, he was using the exact same language to describe his difficulties that I was using in my journal in the 1960s, talking about living in a fog, where meaning was ephemeral, where it just kind of disappeared into a mist, that you couldn't grasp things or hold on to things. And this was a man who was brilliant mathematically before the wound, who could tell time before the wound. Afterwards, he couldn't tell time, he couldn't understand fractions. All the things that I hadn't been able to do from birth, he couldn't do after the wound. So, I mean, I knew I didn't have a bullet in my head, but now I knew what the source of my problem was. It was part of my brain in the left hemisphere, the angular gyrus, that wasn't working properly. And obviously, to create a solution to a problem, you have to first understand what the source of the problem is. So now I knew what my problem was. And if we think about this area, like to get a feel or a sense of this area, it's an area that builds concepts or builds idea, and probably a lot of people in this room are really good in this area. So if you think about the palm of your hand as a concept or an idea or a construct, and you think about your fingers as all the elements that have to come together in the synthesis to build that concept or that construct or that idea, that's what this area does. So if we take a really simple concept, a cat, which we're probably all familiar with, you know, and we think it's nocturnal, it's a carnivore, it has good night vision, fur-bearing, retractable claws. All those elements have to come together to build that idea, that concept. If you have a problem in this part of the brain, the level that I did, or the level Vysotsky did, these pieces always remain disconnected. They never come together in a meaningful way. So you can never build concepts, you can never build ideas, you can't grasp ideas. And that was my challenge. And so what do I do about it? Now I know where the problem is. So the next piece of the solution came in the work of Mark Rosenzweig, who is a psychologist at the University at Berkeley in California. And he was one of the very early researchers looking at neuroplasticity. And he was working with rats, because they're often easier to work with than humans. And what he did is he put rats in different environments. So he'd put a rat in cages, or a cage with lots of other rats and lots of toys to play with, and he called that an enriched environment. And then he put a group of rats in an environment with other rats, but less stimulation, and then he put that poor little rat all by itself with not much to do. And what he did after they'd been exposed to these different environments is he ran them on a maze test, which is like a little intelligence test for rats. And what he found was the group of rats that were in that enriched environment learnt much more effectively on the maze, much more efficiently and much more effectively compared to the other two groups. And then because they were rats, he was able to look at their brains afterwards. And what he found was the brains had changed physiologically. This was early proof of neuroplasticity. And this research has been replicated thousands and thousands of times now. What he found was there's more dendrites. If you think about the neurons, the dendrites are the branches that create the synapses, which allow for more connections, which is really important in neurotransmission. There were actually more neurotransmitters, more glia cells, which are important for neurotransmission, enlarged capillaries, so more blood flowing to the different brain areas. So what it meant was that the brains had changed as a result of the stimulation, which is neuroplasticity, and that change had led to better learning. And then he did what I thought was a really interesting experiment. He put a group of rats in a very tactile environment, and he blindfolded them so they couldn't see. So the only way they could navigate through their environment was through sense of touch. And after that experiment, when he looked at their brains, he found that it was a very specific part of the brain that had changed. That part that I had the difficulty with that didn't register sensation had changed. And for me, that was my aha moment, because it told me differential stimulation leads to differential effect. So if I could find an exercise or an activity that could stimulate that specific part of my brain, possibly I could change it. And at that time, nobody was really looking at human neuroplasticity, but naively or optimistically, I had to believe that humans had as much neuroplasticity as rats. And hopefully we had more neuroplasticity than rats, even though nobody was suggesting that. So I set out to create the first exercise to stimulate my cognitive functioning. And what did I pick? I picked clocks. Because all the research that Luria had done and my experience and Zazetsky's experience was, if there's damage to this area, you cannot tell time. And it wasn't that I wanted to get better at telling time, which I did, but I wanted to force that part of my brain to process relationships. And that was a way, like a window in. I believe there are multiple windows into the different cognitive functioning. This was the window I found into that part of the brain. And so, you know, I was pretty abysmal at the beginning. Like, I couldn't tell time. I was 26. I had to have a friend help me. You know, we'd write down the time. He'd turn the hands of the clock. I would try to read it. But over time, like hundreds of hours of practice, eventually I could start to read those clocks. And I could read them accurately. I could read them really quickly. And now it was great. I could read a two-handed clock. I could tell time, but I wasn't really experiencing any cognitive change. So I knew I had to make it more complex. So I added a third hand, and then did that whole level of the exercise. And now I could read an hour, minute, and second hand on the clock, and that was great. And then I added a fourth hand. And that's when, for me, I had my breakthrough, when I mastered the four-handed clocks, which is like processing 4 relationships simultaneously. And what happened was my world just expanded. I could do things that with the best will in the world I had never been able to do before. Before I talked about how I lived in what I called lag time. I was hours behind everybody else in processing information or understanding concepts, and often I never could. I had a verbatim auditory memory. So I would listen to conversations and I would memorize them. And then I'd walk away, and for 2 hours afterwards I'd play those conversations over and over and over again, trying to understand what had been discussed. And if I was able to understand what had been discussed, it was long after the conversation and everybody else had left. So there was no opportunity to be part of that conversation or that discussion. Now I could actually listen as the conversation was unfolding. I could understand, I could participate, I could interject my thoughts, I could understand what they were responding. And it was incredible for me that I could actually be part of that dialogue and that conversation. And before, when I read anything, I would have to read a page in a book 5 times, 10 times, 15 times, 20 times. And what Luria talked about, if you have this difficulty, and it was my experience, is you can never verify meaning. So as you're reading something, you're always hypothesizing. I think this is what it means, but I'm never sure, which leads to a tremendous sense of uncertainty in your world. Now I could read, and I could understand as I was reading. And then I decided to go back in and teach myself all of mathematics. My father had been a mathematician and a physicist, and he'd always told me math was beautiful, right? It had this majesty and poetry and tapestry and logic, and I'd say, sure, Dad, whatever. But I certainly didn't experience it, and now I could actually see what he had been talking about, because I could understand math from first principles and grasp the logic behind it, which I hadn't been able to before. And what really I found quite remarkable, which I had not at all anticipated happened, was every night after I'd had this change, when I went to bed, it wasn't something I intended to do, but images would come up from my life from like age 4 up until 26. And I would start to understand why things had happened in my life. I'd understand, okay, this happened because of that. Because before there'd been no cause and effect. Because to make a relationship, like to understand cause and effect, you have to see the relationship. And now it felt like my psyche got realigned because I could understand why things happened, whereas before I felt I was always kind of buffeted by random events with no meaning behind them. And since then, I've worked with a number of psychiatrists in Toronto, and Norman Doidge is one of them, who refers some of his clients to me. Because if you have this problem, you can't gain insight. You can't benefit from insight therapy, because what's insight? You have to make those kind of connections. And it's interesting, these psychiatrists know, they say, okay, this individual must be at this level of this cognitive exercise, because now they can start to make insight. And insight is really important for our functioning in the world. And I've also had some students that come to me that are misdiagnosed as having Asperger's, and they have severe problems in this area, so they can't attach meaning, and their world is incredibly confusing. And it's a misdiagnosis in those cases. We address this function, they can relate, their world has meaning. And just quickly to get an idea of the complexity, because what I wanted to do with this area, I saw my change after the 4 hands level. In all of the exercises I've created, I try to bring that function, if it's all possible, up to an average level. And this is what I call lovingly the 10-handed clock. This is the highest level in this reasoning. So somebody to function, and interpret this is reading 10 relationships simultaneously. It goes from all the way from the millennium, century, decade, down to millisecond. And someone who masters this can do this in 5 seconds, which is like a mental workout. And I knew I was onto something when I invented this level, because only 2 people have ever walked through the door of my school and been able to look at this and interpret it. And one was an astronomer from the University of Maryland who was one of the people that discovered radio-emitting galaxies, and the other person was a physicist from Harvard. So I knew that I was really onto something. There are probably some people here, I'm sure, at Microsoft that could interpret this, but the idea is to really force the cognitive function or process in that area. So once I saw that change, I thought, can I take or create an exercise that will address that really uncoordinated part of my body? And it really was a danger. I'd fallen off the wrong end of a diving board and fractured a tooth. I had actually slammed a car door on my head with this left hand and refractured that tooth. It was like this was an alien part of my body, and it would do things. If I wasn't watching it, it would actually do things that weren't in my best interest. And then, by extension, when I learned how to drive, if I didn't know where the left side of my body was, I didn't know where the left side of that car was. So the left side of my car was banged and dented and damaged. So I thought, to create an exercise here, I knew I had to do something with my eyes closed, because how did I compensate? It was with my eyes opened. So I created an exercise where I had to draw really complex shapes eventually with my left hand, until I could be as accurate with my eyes closed as with my eyes open. And the only way I could do that was through registering very, very fine sensation. And now I am functional on that left side of my body. My car doesn't spend any time in the auto body shop, which was really good. And I'm not bruised and banged and dented on that side of my body, which is a relief. And I can do things. Like before, I could not have picked up this glass without it. Or if I had, Sandra probably would be wearing it there in the audience, because I wouldn't know what my hand would do with it. So I addressed that part. And then I thought, okay, can I do that region of the brain that's related to spatial navigation? And for me, any piece of paper that said some assembly required struck fear into my heart, because you have to go from a 2-dimensional representation to construct 3-dimensional objects, like IKEA, if anybody's ever built anything from IKEA. Like for me, the bookcases, the backs were upside down or backwards, and the shelves were upside down. If I sewed from a pattern, everything, I had to rip seams out all the time because I'd sew things upside down. There were no maps in my head. And also, whenever I would go anyplace new, I always calculated in what I called lost time. I would have to add an hour at a minimum, to any new location I was going to, because I knew I would get lost multiple times before I finally found my way, because there were no maps in my head. You can tell somebody that has maybe a mild problem in this area if they're driving, and the map is here, and they have to turn the map in the direction they're going. That's kind of an indication that they may have a trouble with that mental rotation. For me, it was even worse. There were no maps in my head. And some of these problems are hereditary. And interestingly, my mother had this difficulty, and one of my 4 brothers had this difficulty. And my mother did have a good attitude about things. So she would say whenever we get into a car to go anywhere, we were having an adventure. And we always knew where we were starting, and we knew where we wanted to end up, but it was truly a black hole in between. Like there were no maps in either of our heads. And we always got to where we were intending to get to, but we never got there the same way twice. So we saw a lot of interesting territory. And as I got older, I once asked her, had this had an impact on her life? And she shared with me that she had wanted to be a chemist, and she had gone to her first year of university to study chemistry, and her professor had suggested that she actually pick a different major because she couldn't construct molecules. If you think about those molecules, right, that you have to construct in three-dimensional representation, three-dimensional space, she could not do this because there were no maps, no ability to construct three-dimensional space. My brother, that has this problem, at a lesser degree, did become a chemist, because these things work on a continuum. Nobody has them exactly to the same degree, but he couldn't become an organic chemist because he could construct the molecules, but it was too much effort, so he became a physical chemist. So what I've learned is no part of the brain is irrelevant or unimportant. If there's a difficulty in any part, it will have some impact on people's functioning. So this began my life's work. So I went back into Laurie's work, and what I came to understand is each one of us has our own unique cognitive profile. And for individuals that are struggling with learning, it's when multiple areas come together to make the learning process difficult. And the work that I've developed, I can now identify and have programs, cognitive programs, to stimulate function in 19 different areas, from nonverbal reading of interpretations and situations, auditory memory, motor plans for writing, visual memory for symbol patterns. And in order to address a problem that somebody has, you need to understand its very nature, because you have to target that difficulty to change it. I mean, that is how the brain works. You need very targeted stimulation. And what's very interesting, I learned a lot from the students that I work with and from the parents that I work with. And one parent said to me very aptly, school is just a metaphor for life. If you have these kind of problems, they aren't going to stop at the classroom door. They're going to follow the person out through life. And what Lurie talked about, he described the brain as a functional system. We now talk about neural networks. It's the same concept. There is no one part of the brain that reads or that writes. Whenever we do any kind of intellectual task, multiple areas come together to carry out that task. And each one of those areas has its own job, its own function. And it can be involved in multiple tasks. So if you have a problem, it can affect a number of activities. And this is a blood flow study that just illustrates this. This came out of Sweden. And this is the brain reading out loud. So you can see there's no one area that's involved in reading. There are areas that remember the look of the word, the visual pattern of the letters. There are areas that discriminate speech sound, because you have to hear the sounds to be able to then attach the sounds to the letters. There are parts of the brain that are critical in eye tracking. In reading. There are parts of the brain, the Broca's, that's involved in the phonological aspect or processing. All of these areas have to come together for somebody to be able to read easily. And anybody that works with children that are struggling with reading knows you can have 5 children that are having reading difficulties, and each one can have a different profile, depending on what combination of these areas are impacted. And there are some students I see that have all of these areas impacted, and those are the ones that walk through the door. They might be in grade 10 and are reading at grade 2, because they have no part of the brain that can support the reading process. And obviously, to address any problem, we have to be targeting the specific area that that individual has to give them a strength in that area so that they can go forward with reading. And if we think about special education processes or approaches, they all have benefit. And certainly growing up, I used everything that was possible. So they're what I call compensatory processes or approaches, which is the child can't write, you give them voice recognition software, which can be of great help. So the concept here is we're working around the deficit. We're finding a strength or technology to support the area of difficulty, but we're not changing the area of difficulty. And then there's what I call content skill-based approaches. And these are ones where you have to learn how to read, and there are multiple reading programs out there. And what the best will do is look at the cognitive profile of the individual, and if they're strong phonologically but poor in the visual recognition, you'd pick a program like phonographics to teach reading that calls on their strength. And then the strategy-based approaches, which are of benefit, where you are going to learn a rule or a strategy, like metacognition, that you can apply to solve a problem. And you learn where you use those strategies, what kinds of problems they solve. But all of these approaches come out of what I call the pre-neuroplastic paradigm. They all come out of the idea that the learner's fixed. We're not changing the learner using these approaches. We are accepting the cognitive profile of that learner, and we're adapting the curriculum to that profile. And then there are programs that I call capacity-based, which my program is. There's CogMed, there's some other programs that are being developed. And here the principle is we're actually going to change the learner. We're going to change the fundamental cognitive capacity of the learner so they can learn curriculum, they can learn strategies, they can learn content. And these approaches, and my approach, come out of neuroscience, not out of education. And here we believe we can actually change the functioning of the learner. And if we think about this concept of neuroplasticity, which we hear a lot about, often we think it's a positive thing. It really is a neutral phenomenon. It just means that the brain is capable of change as a result of experience or stimulation. It can change in negative ways. Actually, there's research now to show that certain long-term exposure to things like chronic stress, sleep deprivation, like we're a society of people that are sleep deprived, chronic pain, prolonged anxiety, actually changes the brain at a physiological level in a negative way. And there are things that can increase the positive aspects of neuroplasticity to make the brain function more efficiently and effectively. And really what we want to do in our lives and in our practices working with people are, as much as possible, increase those positive factors and reduce the negative factors. And the principles of the program that I've developed are really working to enhance those positive factors related to positive brain change. So the first one is, I guess I've talked about, is design a task that's very targeted to the specific cognitive function to stimulate it. And the next piece is you have to start the level of difficulty, you have to calibrate the level of difficulty of the task to the current functioning that that individual is holding at. So we do that through an assessment process. So if the cognitive functioning area is here, we're not going to start the exercise up here because the brain is going to spin wheels. It is not going to engage, and it's just going to be frustrating. And that's a lot of the experience of these children in school. If we start it way down here, again, there'll be no stimulation, no effort for processing. It is not going to change the brain. So we have to start the level of difficulty just slightly above the current holding capacity to stimulate that function. And then the function comes up, then we step up the level of difficulty. And we have to remove the support of the other areas that would normally compensate. And that is one of the hardest things I've found for individuals with learning difficulties, because their compensations have been life-saving. I mean, I know all the compensations I developed allowed me to function to a certain degree. And here we're saying we want to take those away, because as soon as a student compensates in an activity, it means they're diverting energy to other parts of the brain, which is limiting the stimulation to the area that we're trying to target. And I've seen so many different creative ways that students compensate. There was that exercise I created for what I call the kinesthetic, the registering of sensation. And I had a student, as I was watching them, I knew they weren't doing it quite correctly, and I couldn't tell why. So I asked her what she was doing, and she was a musician. And instead of registering the sensation as her body was moving, she'd memorized musical phrases. And she knew exactly the length of the phrase that told her when her muscles had to stop. So we worked with her to help her understand why that wouldn't support her changing her brain, and eventually she could drop out that compensation, and she did work on that area and actually went on to win some major badminton championship because she could now coordinate her body in space and hit the birdie with the racket. And then we build in performance criteria. In every single exercise, the student has to be 90% or better, because for cognitive functioning to be holding in an area, it has to be really accurate, or it's not processing effectively at that level. It has to be consistent. If the student gets 90% once, that's wonderful, but they have to do it over a run of trials, and they have to be automatic. If something is taking them an hour and it should take 5 seconds, we have to get them down to the 5 seconds. And once they meet these criteria, then the level of difficulty steps up. And sometimes we have students say, you know, after they've mastered something, they want to just kind of go on cruise control and enjoy that mastery. But just to know, as soon as your brain is on cruise control, you're not stimulating function. And it's nice to be on cruise control, but it's not stimulating cognitive change. And sometimes, you know, people ask, why do we insist on this mastery criteria? And there are other cognitive programs out there. But for the brain to really change in a meaningful way, it needs to be really solidly processing at that level. And if we stop our training before it meets these criteria, we haven't got that cognitive function up the level that we need it. And I've tracked people over 30 years out of the program, and what I see is there's no drop-off in function. Once the cognitive area is solidly there, they just start to use their brain in their everyday activity in that neural network, and it gets its own stimulation, so they don't have to continue to do the exercises, because we've really got that section of the brain up and functioning solidly at that level. So if you want to kind of try an activity to see where you are on a continuum of one of the cognitive functions, there's part of the brain, I call it symbol recognition, some researchers call it the brain's letterbox, or visual word form area. So if you want to think of the word cat, it's a fairly simple word, and you want to close your eyes and see, can you actually see that word in your mind's eye, or almost like it's projected up on a blackboard? And some people will be able to see it really crisply and really clearly. Other people, it might be a fuzzy image. The children or individuals that have problems here will just see the back of their eyelids, or just black. They will not see the letters. And those are the children that are going to be dyslexic or struggle with reading. So if we think about this area, if you're strong here, this is that visual photographic memory for text. This a person can look at something and just visually remember it. So they're going to learn reading patterns, spelling patterns. If they struggle here, this is the child that will read the same word or see the same word 5 times on a page and have trouble reading it each time because they don't hold the look of the word. Obviously, they're going to be slow in reading. They're going to struggle with spelling. Any kind of visual, even learning visual, like chemical equations, any kind of visual template learning, math formula is going to be hard for them to learn. And what do we do for this area? This is one of the exercises. This is Amharic from Ethiopia. And people ask, why do I use foreign languages? Well, again, I don't want students to be able to compensate. I want to be stimulating that visual part of the brain that holds symbol patterns. So if I used English, they could put sound to it. They could put meaning to it. There would be familiarity. It wouldn't be just stressing that part of the brain. And there are multiple different languages that I've built into the computer. And by the time a child can memorize and hold in their mind's eye 8 Chinese characters, English actually is pretty easy to learn the visual symbol patterns. It's not that I want to get them proficient at Chinese, but I want to stimulate that cognitive function so that part of the brain holds visual symbol patterns. And what changes as a result of this, we've got a lot of research studies that are on the website if people are interested. It's arrowsmithschool.org. We know that students with learning problems don't learn a year for a year. So this was a group in the Toronto Catholic District School Board in Toronto, which is a publicly funded school board. And they were learning at 2/3 of a year per year prior to the program. After the program, or partway through the program, their rate of learning doubled and tripled, which to me is the power of a cognitive program. We're not teaching skills. We're not teaching spelling. We're not teaching reading. We are changing the brain so that it can learn the things that it's designed to learn. And it can pick up the learning everywhere through all of their exposure and experience. And then the other study was one done at Arrowsmith School in Vancouver on the Woodcock-Johnson, again, showing the kinds of things that you'd expect to change as a result of that cognitive stimulation. And then this is a right hemisphere function. We just tried actually a left hemisphere function with the word cat. This is, can you imagine a cat, like the actual cat, which we've probably all seen, and can you think about a cat? Close your eyes, and can you actually see a cat? Can you see it in all its glory, with its ears and its fur and its tail? So just see whether you can call up an image of a cat in your mind's eye. And then you can see how well you did on that continuum. I mean, some people who are exceptionally strong here they can even see the gradation and the shading in the cat's fur. Other people kind of see a line drawing or you know, not too many visual elements, and some people don't see anything. And this area is a critical area in the right hemisphere for remembering landmarks, remembering the look of a place that you've gone to before. So if somebody has a difficulty here, they'll get lost, not because of the way I had the problem with spatial maps, but they don't remember the landmarks. They don't remember the look of a place. They also will have trouble with visual imagery. Somebody that has this difficulty will not like to meditate, because when you meditate, you call up your happy place. Like you conjure up a visual image that calms you. If somebody has this difficulty, they can't call up those visual images. This is the area that Oliver Sacks' book, The Man That Mistook His Wife for a Hat, is talking about. I had someone who had traumatic head injury. He was hit by a truck when he was 11, and he came to me when he was 33. And he had massive damage to this area. And the first day he walked into my school, he tried to walk out a filing cabinet because it looked like a door to him. Like it had the same visual elements. Like it was kind of rectangular and it had a handle. If he saw me in the school, he knew who I was. If 2 seconds later he saw me in the hallway, he didn't know who I was because he couldn't hold the visual look to match it up to me. I often call this the refrigerator dysfunction, because this is the person, and I think there's some research to say that men have a little bit more of a difficulty here than women. The person opens the refrigerator and says, like, where's the mustard? And there it is right in front of them. But it's because they don't hold the visual look of the object to match it up to what they're looking for. So someone with this difficulty will not like to shop because they'll walk by the item that they're looking for multiple times. And I had a garden writer once who had this difficulty, and if you can imagine, like she couldn't hold the image of the plants, so she'd have to use language like it was the clematis, growing up the fence with the large purple leaves, which really is pretty limiting if you're trying to write about gardens. And then if you have the face recognition part, it's a difficulty. This is a person that will recognize, again, their neighbor on their porch, but 2 minutes later, if the neighbor's walking down the street, they won't recognize them. And a friend of mine had this difficulty, and we worked on it. She doesn't anymore. And she was a reporter at the Toronto Star, which is a big newspaper in Toronto. And for 20 years, she rode the same elevator, probably with the same people, to her workplace, and she didn't recognize who was on the elevator with her. So she decided her strategy was going to be friendly to everybody. So she figured some people would think she's just a little too over-friendly, but she felt that was more, would less likely result in her offending somebody that she should know, because she didn't know if she knew them or not, because she just couldn't recognize their faces, and now she can. And then just quickly, I'll go through a couple other areas. This is a very easy area to identify. This is, you ask a student or ask an individual to tell you a story, and they can tell you an elaborate story, give them 5 or 10 minutes, and they can just talk and talk and talk. You put a pen in their hand or a pencil, give them the same 5 or 10 minutes, and maybe 1 sentence, 2 sentences goes down. So they've got the thought, they've got the content, but it doesn't get translated into the motor plan, into the written expression. And students with this difficulty often talk about feeling locked inside their head because they can't externalize on paper what they know. So it affects writing, obviously, spelling, not because they don't remember the visual look of the word, but they don't remember the motor plan. So it just doesn't fire out in an automatic motor plan. So this is a student that can spell the same word 5 different ways on the page because it comes out differently each time. And it affects reading, not because they don't remember the visual look of the word, but they can't eye track. So this is the student that makes these kinds of reading errors. So they'll have the right letters in the word, like calm and clam, but the eye tracking doesn't work smoothly. Or they'll use their finger to track because they'll lose their place when they're reading, because the part of the brain that's developing the well-ordered fixations for tracking is implicated. And it also affects mathematics. This is a student that will say, please don't make me show my rough work on the paper. I can do the calculations in my head, but they know if they have to write them down, they're going to make mistakes. Or they're going to misread the sign, and they're going to add instead of multiply. Or they'll miscopy the question down. The last one I saw a student say 3 into 15 is 5, so she knew the answer, but the last thing she saw was a 3, and that's the number that got written down. Teachers will often say to these students, you're making careless errors. They are not careless errors. These are motor slips. These children do not externalize the proper motor patterns. And the exercise for this, she looks like a happy pirate. We use an eye patch because it's a motor functioning, and the eye motor movements in the right eye talk to the left premotor region, and that's where we're trying to get more stimulation into that area, and they learn lots and lots of motor plans. And we see things like legibility in writing, amount of writing, the ability for the person to edit, eye tracking, reading speed improves, and obviously fewer errors. And a lot of students with this difficulty, as a 14-year-old boy, print instead of write, because printing relies on more discrete motor movements and it places less of a load on that cognitive function. We don't work on handwriting, we work on the cognitive exercise, and you can see over time the students' writing changed from printing and writing to writing. And that is because the cognitive capacity was in place for the person to learn these motor plans for writing. This was a student that was given 10 minutes to write on a topic. This was a year later, same 10 minutes, and it went on for 3 pages. And again, he had all these ideas in his head. We didn't put the ideas in his head. Now he could put them down on paper. And this was an English teacher describing a student that was going through this exercise and the changes that she saw in her English work. And again, you can just see it graphically. I mean, it's more organized. This is a student, if they're writing, they'll go off the page, around the corner, they'll go onto the desk. Now the student can organize the motor plan on the page. And this is a student, too, that traditionally you hear in psychological reports, give the child more time on the test because they can't externalize their thought. By the end of this exercise, these students can do time tests within the time limits. They don't need extra time. And these are a couple of studies. Again, they're all on the website, showing the kinds of things you'd expect to change as a result of that cognitive function. And this was a study. Sometimes people say, you know, they're a little nervous, like we're going to take students out of academics half of a day and do brain exercises. And, you know, how is that going to help them learn? Well, we learn with our brain. That's kind of how it helps them learn, because some of these students could sit in class forever and they're not going to benefit from the instruction. And this study I really like because it was done by somebody actually who was quite opposed to my program and the Vancouver School Board. And the blue is Arrowsmith and the red is learning assistant students. And so those learning assistant students were getting English, they were getting spelling, they were getting reading, writing every single day. The Arrowsmith students were getting cognitive exercises. After 8 to 9 months, the Arrowsmith students actually did better on spelling and also on reading comprehension than the learning assistant students, even though they weren't getting exposure to that material, but now their brain could process that material. And again, to me, this just points to the power of this work, that it is really with our brain that we learn and engage in the learning process. And this is a brochure that's on our website, and I think I brought a few of them here, that just summarizes all of the studies. And what's really exciting, Howard Eaton and I of Eaton Arrowsmith School formed a research group about a year ago, I think, and we are now involved in a research study with the University of Calgary looking at outcome measures on the Woodcock cognitive achievement and academic and seeing really, really positive results. And we're just working with researchers at UBC, starting an imaging study in the next few weeks. We're just finalizing that, and also the University of Southern Illinois doing imaging, because I mean my interest is finding out, I mean I know the work works, but how can I enhance this work? How can I actually make it more effective for what I call the end user, which is the child sitting at that desk that needs this kind of work. So I'm hoping that what we discover in these scans will help us improve the delivery of the system. And then my favorite area is what I call artifactual thinking. And this is, probably I should have called it nonverbal thinking, but this was a lot of years ago and I like that term. This is really the part of the brain in the right hemisphere that plans and thinks nonverbally. One researcher calls it cognitive Goldilocks, which I think is really an appropriate term, because it's the part of the brain that allows us to project ourselves into a situation before actually being in that situation and imagine what outcome do we want to create. And then once we get into the situation, it allows us to problem solve and plan to see, are we on target to create that outcome? And if not, then what strategies can we use to modify our behavior, modify the situation to create the outcome. So it's thinking, planning, problem solving in the nonverbal realm. And if somebody's good here, this is the person that can walk into a situation, read all the subtle cues and nuances, and is really socially apt and socially appropriate. And if they have a problem here, this is the individual that is awkward socially, uncomfortable socially. You can give them a rule, like in a social situation, do X, Y, and Z, but they misapply it. They'll apply it to a situation where it doesn't really work. And, you know, I believe there's no rule book for life. You have to be able to generate your rules in all of these different situations that you come into, and that's what this cognitive function allows you to do. I like to make up terms, so I talk about premature closure, which for me is the student that goes into a situation, or the individual, and there are multiple things happening. They'll look at one or two details or factors, they'll make an interpretation, and then they'll run with that interpretation. But it isn't accurate because it's only taking a subset of the information. So it means that they end up getting into difficulty socially, or the other way is this is the person that leaps before they fully look at the situation. And this was a picture that I gave to a young girl. She was 12 that had this difficulty, and nobody in her neighborhood would play with her. And she had a reputation, they called her, they said she was a teller of tall tales, which is sort of a nice way to say they thought she was lying a lot. And it really wasn't that she was telling tall tales, it was just she didn't read situations very well. So I showed her this picture and asked her what she thought was happening here. And she told me they're playing badminton. So I kept a very straight face and I asked her to explain why. And it's sort of hard to see, but the woman with her hands outstretched has netting on her hat, if you can sort of see that. It's easier in the real picture. And this girl saw the netting, it triggered an association, netting, badminton, they're playing badminton. Very, very severe premature closure, like looking at one element and making a whole interpretation. So it really put into perspective why nobody wanted to play with her in her neighborhood, because she was making these kinds of incorrect interpretations all the time. And then an 18-year-old girl looked at this picture and told me they were at City Hall. And I asked her why she thought that. And she pointed to the rope in the foreground. And she'd been to City Hall in Toronto, and there was a section of the area outside of the City Hall that was cordoned off with a rope. So it triggered that association. So again, imagine these individuals' world. It's really hard for them to navigate socially. And then this is a classic Norman Rockwell picture, the little girl that's lost her 2 front teeth and her friend's reaction to that. And probably 80% of the people that have this difficulty in nonverbal interpretation will look at this picture and say they're having a shouting match. Because what they're focusing on is the mouth being open, and that triggers an association with a shouting match. But I mean, they don't look at all the information. That girl doesn't look like she's angry. She actually kind of looks like she's happy and proud of whatever's going on. And certainly in my world, if somebody's shouting abuse at me, I'm not going to be leaning in like the other girl is to hear more of that abuse. So the body language doesn't fit the interpretation. And I had a teacher, one of my teachers, her son was in my school, he was 12, and he had this difficulty. So I was describing this picture and explaining his interpretation. So she asked if she could take it home and show her husband. And I said, sure. So she walked through the door and held up the picture, and her husband looked at it and said, oh, that's interesting, they're having a shouting match. And sort of shows that these things are inherited, but also, she said it explained a lot in their marriage. But he had it to a much less degree than the son had it. And we have a whole program for this area which stimulates this function, which allows these individuals to have a real relationships in the social world and do all that planning and thinking. We know in the adolescent class when we're being successful because they start massively dating because they can now have all these kind of relationships. So for a while they don't really want to do any more of the exercise because they're so excited about having relationships. But it's a positive thing. And then I work with individuals, obviously, who have attention deficit or attention deficit hyperactive disorder. And in a lot of cases, students that come into the program that are on medication when they walk through the door, by the end of the program, 75 to 80% of the students are off medication. And for a number of reasons. One is what I call cognitive load. These students are sitting in class with a number of cognitive deficits that means it's really hard for them to attend. They're being asked to do things in class that take extra energy and effort for them to attend, and the brain goes refractory. It just gets exhausted, and then their attention starts to wander and drift, and they start to engage in behaviors that their teachers wish they wouldn't. And as we lighten that load by addressing the cognitive functions, the individual can sit in class and do what is being required of them, and they can sustain attention. And then there's a group that have what I call symbolic and artifactual thinking, which is the prefrontal cortex in the right and left hemisphere. And part of the job of that part of the brain is to keep attention relevantly focused towards a goal. It's very much what that part of the brain does. It allows you to say this information is important to solve that goal, this information over here is irrelevant, so don't get distracted by it. If somebody has a problem here, all information is equally relevant. So the butterfly flying outside the window is just as important as the math question in front of them. And again, as we address that cognitive function, that part of the brain comes online to be able to regulate attention, and the children can come off of, children, adolescents, adults, off of medication. And then some of the other areas, we work on auditory memory, have all sorts of different programs for different aspects of auditory memory. The child that comes home, they know they're supposed to do homework, but they can't remember the instructions of what they're supposed to do. The child that you tell to do 3 things, they come back with 1 or 2 done, and have no recollection of the 3rd thing. Some adults I know that are writing all over their hands, or they've got Post-it notes all around their house because they know they won't remember the information, or they're lost if they don't have their to-do list because they can't hold the information. These are people that aren't going to like books on tape because they aren't going to hold the auditory information. And often they get labeled as irresponsible because they don't do what they're asked to do, and they really aren't irresponsible. They can't hold the auditory information. And then I have a program for what I call quantity blindness. These are the people that have no sense of number. So for them, 10, 100, 1,000 all means the same thing. So they can't time schedule, they can't budget, they run out of gas on the highway. I had a psychiatrist that had this problem. She was always double booking people because she just had no sense of how long things took, which irritated a lot of her clients. So we worked on that area, and she now can do that. And then I work with a lot of adults and see what I call a cognitive mismatch. This is where parts of somebody's brain aren't compatible with the demands of the job that they're involved in. I had a pilot that had the auditory memory problem. And his strategy was, whenever he was flying into busy airspace, was to ask the air traffic controller to repeat the instructions over and over again because he couldn't remember them. And my fear was, what if that air traffic controller is really, really busy and can only say those instructions once? He couldn't remember them. So my joke was, I used to ask him if I was ever getting on a plane to file his flight plan with me, so I wasn't flying in the same airspace as he was. But the better solution was, we addressed the problem, and now he can just hold the information. He can hear it and hold it. I had a pathologist. He was doing his residency in pathology at actually a teaching hospital in the United States. And he had that object recognition piece in the right hemisphere. And he didn't realize he had the difficulty. He was examining breast tissue, and it was somebody that had cancer, and they were seeing whether she was in remission. She'd had chemotherapy and radiation, and he knew how important this determination was. So he was really careful and really diligent. And he was just about to sign off that the person was in remission when his supervisor came over and said, "Didn't you see these cells up here? This is cancer." So some of the things we think are human error could be this cognitive mismatch. He realized this was really serious and significant. He exited his residency, addressed this problem, and he won't make that kind of mistake. I had a butcher who had that kinesthetic problem. And imagine if you don't know where this hand is and you got a really sharp knife in this hand, it's really not a good career choice. So the first day he came into my school, his left hand was all in bandages. So obviously we addressed that problem, and he doesn't make that difficulty. I had someone on the Olympic ski jump team in Canada who had a very, very mild problem here, but for him a mild problem was really significant because you're coming out those chutes at whatever speed they're going, and he would just make a slight imperception or slightly misread where that part of his body was in space, and he would tend to fall to that side. So I'm just going to kind of go through sort of quickly. Like, we know that for neuroplastic change, I think I talked about this briefly, there's certain things that have to be. I mean, I wish it was a quick fix. I wish it was really easy, but it isn't. The brain doesn't change all that easily, not in a sustained way. So any activity we do that's really going to change the brain requires real active, sustained engagement, lots of repetition. And neuroscience is talking about this thing called effortful processing, which is, again, where you have to calibrate the level of the difficulty of the activity, so it's really a mental workout for the brain. And one of the ways you can do that is this novelty and task complexity, like with the clocks. I did everything I could with 2 hands. I had a 3rd hand, then a 4th hand. Now we have 10 hands. It's to increase the complexity to make that brain process. And as I said at the beginning of the talk, what's really exciting to me is there's plasticity over our lifespan. I've worked across the whole age span, and I see the 81-year-old made the same progress as the 15-year-old. And there's lots of research going on now looking at variability and plasticity, which is really interesting. I mean, I've practically seen students that come in, they have very similar profiles, same age, same gender, do the same amount of work, and they both make progress, but one moves 4 times more quickly than another one. And it just makes sense. There are individual differences in everything, so why wouldn't there be individual differences in plasticity? So there's a lot of research now, a lot of it's coming out of Sweden, looking at some of the factors that make somebody have more neuroplasticity or less neuroplasticity. And as we understand this more, we can use it to enhance these kind of programs. And just again, repeating what I've said, but again, we know every time we do something with our brain, it changes it, but the kind of change we're talking about here is really profound change that takes an incredible amount of effort and work and energy to change it. But then those changes are there for life. And what can we do to sustain these changes? I mean, we can keep our brain active over our lifetime in our own lives. We can try to be less sleep deprived. I mean, meditation, reduce stress and anxiety, increase effort for processing, active engagement. And we've all heard that Hebb's principle, neurons that fire together, wire together, that make those parts of the brain function more effectively. And why is it important? It's important because it allows the brain to function optimally and to learn and kind of navigate through our world. And people often ask, like, what is my vision for education? Really, I mean, having struggled with learning disabilities myself and knowing the anguish that costs. I mean, at some level, this is, I believe, alleviating human suffering. And I work with lots of adults. And what they tell me all the time is, at a certain point in their life, they stopped dreaming. They did not dare to dream. I mean, the doors just started closing and their life got more and more constricted. And they feel in a lot of cases that their career was chosen for them because there were so few doors open that they could only walk through those doors. And I think what this work allows people to do is not only dream, but actually competently realize their dream because they have the cognitive capacity to navigate through the world and learn. And it opens up more doors and more possibilities for these individuals to walk through. And my kind of reason for being in life is really to make this work more accessible to individuals that are having learning challenges, to make it available in schools. This is teacher training in August in 2013 in Toronto. There are teachers here from Australia, New Zealand, United States. Actually, there might be, I don't know whether some of the teachers that are here in the audience today were in this picture, and Canada. And I'm committed to training more teachers to really, we've got probably millions of data points of all of these children's progress from 1978 when I started this work up until now, and to really mine this data so that we can enhance the delivery and the effectiveness of the program, so that children have a different trajectory through education and that they can actually experience learning as joyful and easy and pleasurable. And that is my true vision for education. So I thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Yep. Yes?
Suffer issues that you described, one of them automated processing disorder. Some time back, I looked up the Arrowsmith program, and I read that it's actually not just kids with autism to attend the program, which is one
Yeah, I've worked with individuals with Asperger's, which is the high-functioning autism, and there those whole nonverbal pieces and auditory processing, reasoning, we've had success. The progress through the program is a bit slower, partly because a lot of those students, it's harder for them to maintain engagement, not because they get distracted externally, but internally by the processes going on within them. Students that are more severe on the autistic spectrum, we don't really understand what's going on in the brain. For my work to work, it's very targeted cognitive stimulation to very specific parts of the brain. So if I don't understand what I'm targeting, I can't create a program or an exercise for that.
Your work with the neuroplasticity, how do you feel about the people who talk about the neurological reorganization
for the developmental movement. Because I recently suffered some brain damage, and I've had somebody who's told me that I needed to do that, which was the...
Oh, the crawling?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, I believe there are multiple windows into different cognitive functions, and what I've discovered is a series of windows into different cognitive functions. It doesn't mean that other people haven't come up with ways that can stimulate function, and I guess it would be, my comment would be to look at what they're asking you to do and think, does that match where you're having difficulty? And if you feel it doesn't, then it's probably unlikely that it's going to be of benefit.
Crawling in a particular way, which I can understand. I can understand the work in your practice and
Yes.
the difficulty of crawling.
Very quick question. So you mentioned in your childhood you were not eager to try new things, and it was difficult conceptually for you to reach out to something because you had held on to. And what are the strategies you would recommend, like if you're trying to get our children to do something new? And because my son, he just wants to do his usual things. He loves his routine, and I'm trying to get him to do something else.
If there's a real cognitive difficulty there, the best approach is to address the cognitive difficulty, to find a program. You know, if there's a school, there's schools here that can deliver this program to actually stimulate function, so then you don't have to use a strategy. He actually can do things differently. He can compare and contrast and do all of that. If that's not an option, it's kind of look at the task and see how you can break it down to very, very simple steps. And do it gradually, because if it's too overwhelming, like for me, everything was overwhelming, and that created anxiety. I used to talk about, I lived in amygdala hell, which was just terror and fear all the time, and when you're in that state you can't learn. But maybe if somebody had understood and just made it really simple, like kind of one tiny little step, and helped me understand, rather than the whole overwhelming megillah of everything, that would be my best recommendation if you can't access the program. Yeah.
Are there profiles of individuals with learning disabilities that you've seen that your program can't help? And if so, is that something you can identify up front? So that's my first question. And my second question is, are there options here locally for Arrowsmith?
Okay, so I can answer both of those. My program is very broad because it's addressing 19 different cognitive functions. And what I say to parents or educators, go on the website or look in my book. I describe all of the areas that we work with. And if you see a match to your child or a child in your class to those profiles, then this program will be appropriate. It's so broad, and it covers the very common areas that are related to learning difficulties that in most cases it's going to address those problems. And in terms of schools that are here, there's a school in Bothell, that Heritage Christian Academy, and I'm doing a talk there tonight, and it offers the program. And then there's a Gateway and Crosspoint that's in Polsbo and Bremerton. So those are the schools outside of the Seattle area that currently offer the program. On my website, there's a little button called Participating Schools. You can go in there and it'll show the schools around the world that offer the program.
You mentioned that these challenges that you experienced were also existing in your mother and in your brother. They often seem to run in families. Last time I checked your website, you did not have anything for home implementation, but when you get into a family, you're talking to go to a private school, $17,000 a year, you multiply that times several children, you're talking about a house mortgage.
Yeah.
Is there any plan to get it implementable on a homeschooling basis, or some other way that it can be implemented on students that cannot attend private schools?
Yeah, I mean, my commitment is to make it accessible, and it's looking at how is that possible. So one is obviously private schools, but then there's private school tuition. One is, getting publicly funded schools interested, and we're in just a public school in Toronto, one in Auckland, which doesn't really help you very much, one in Sydney in Australia. But that's my commitment. I mean, it just takes time. I mean, publicly funded school, it's a larger bureaucracy. And long term, to see are there ways that I can deliver this remotely. I mean, currently the model that we've had a lot of success with and works really well is the school gets interested, we create a relationship with the school, because we need certain requirements met. We need the school to agree to give me or give the program 4 cognitive periods, 4 40-minute periods a day. So it means we're taking really half of the student's day to do cognitive exercises. Less than that is not going to benefit the student, and I will not do anything that won't benefit the student. So it really works well in a school-based program because we're taking half of the day of that child, and then the school will send teachers to be trained, and then we have ongoing support delivery model, ongoing professional development with the school. But I'm always looking at how can I maintain the integrity of the program and deliver it more broadly and make it more accessible. That's always what drives me.
So do you find that people are moving to Toronto to have access to that one public school system in the North American continent?
People within the Toronto region are trying to move, but because it's only one school system and we're in 4 schools and that's 40 students, which is tiny, they're taking students pretty much out of their school system.
They thought that they were going to have this last school year as a trial school, but I think it's at the last moment that some of us are in contact with people in Oregon trying to support that and figure out how they're doing that.
Yeah.
Because that's certainly the goal to deliver it. I mean, public would be ideal.
That's the charter school. They're voting tonight in Portland. They're voting tonight to see whether it's going into a charter school, which there won't be tuition. Yeah.
You mentioned working with adults.
Okay. So.
You mentioned working with adults. What are the options?
With adults, I mean, some adults come into the full day program. Schools that have run the program after 2 years of sort of successfully running the program, they can offer a part-time program. So adults, and that depends on whether the school wants to do that. And a lot of schools offer part-time programs. I mean, Arrowsmith in Vancouver, I think Gateway here is looking at, in February, starting a part-time program, and that would be after hours. But usually what we can do is work on one cognitive function at a time, because we need 4 hours per week to affect change. But we've had a lot of success with that, with adults. So it would be, if you're interested, would go on the website and contact. I think Gateway is they said they were starting in February. Yeah. Okay, I think, is that, yeah, just one.
So we hear about all these new websites coming up with brain training and stuff. Do they have any credibility based on your research, like lumosity.com and LearningRx, and there's so many out there now, it really confuses us. Do they have any credibility?
It is confusing. I mean, Lumosity comes out of, I think, Good Neuroscience. Posit Science, which is Michael Merznick out of UCSF, is good science. But they're doing general stimulation. It's going to have limited benefit for an individual struggling with learning difficulties because it's not targeted stimulation to the area that they're having difficulty with. I would say they're more, for us, we're getting older, I mean, just to keep our brain sharp, like good general stimulation, but they aren't designed or targeted for individuals struggling with learning problems.
So in that case, how do we get our children, or even adults, how do you get actually diagnosed? Is that something as part of the program? Is that the first step that you take, or do we do that elsewhere from kind of psychologist? How does that work?
Some people come in with having psychological reports, having a report from a psychologist. Other individuals just go on the website and they say this, this, and this. We're working on an online questionnaire that hopefully should be available in about a month, that people would be able to go on the website and answer the detailed questions on a continuum, and then it would say, well, it looks like your child has this profile, and that would suggest that they could benefit, because it's expensive to go to a psychologist and get your child assessed. Ideally, if you don't need to do that and you can say, yes, this is a match according to the areas, then you don't need to have a separate assessment.